Okay, so we're looking at the subject, we're looking at the surface. This is Pastel Premier surface that I'm using. I'll go through the pastels in a moment and just talk about those colors and what we need and all of those things. But let's just take a look at our subject. And oftentimes we need to make some changes in a subject. And quite often I don't work from just one subject. I'll work from maybe a couple of subjects that have a similar look or a similar feel, so that I can look and see perhaps I could add some things in from one or the other. Today I'm going to stay mostly with this one, but I want you to think about the idea of using more than just one photograph. One photograph is usually a little limiting. So one of the things that happens in this particular photograph is that your eye is drawn to the top of the picture because of all of these darks and all of this information up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that information down the picture a little bit and move those branches away and not make this quite so dark or quite so interesting in shape, because that's what pulls our eye up to the surface, is the fact that it changes shape, and we really don't want to be focused up here. We prefer to be focused in this area where the light is really lovely. So I'm going to be very careful to see if I can change that just a little bit today. Remember that you always take off the last 1/4 inch of your paper, because eventually when you frame this, that will go underneath the mat, and you want to be sure not to paint anything too close to the edge. So I'm just using a little fine charcoal to just take that edge away, just to remind myself that that's where I really don't want anything important. Okay, so start with that always. This is a vertical subject, so I'm turning the paper vertically this time. And now I'm going to think about the thirds. When I design and draw, I'm always thinking about composition and how we can arrange things in an interesting way. And so one of the ways that we do that is to think about taking the thirds, like this, through our painting and placing subjects and objects that are important in the important places of those thirds. Okay, these are the little sweet spots. Those are the important places. So using the vine charcoal, it will disappear into the final painting. You don't have to worry about that. So we have one major tree here, which is our focal point, and we want to put that tree close to this third. Okay, we don't want it to be right in the center. So we're going to think about the idea of maybe putting this tree. Let's see what sort of size we want this tree to be. We want a little area in the foreground here, so we probably want it to be about this size, maybe just a little bit bigger, and we'll have it go off, but not quite at the angle that it has in the photograph. Okay, it gets a little narrower as it goes to the top. All trees get narrower as they go to the top. All branches get narrower as they leave the tree. And so that's kind of going to be the focal point of our painting here. And now the other trees, what I'm going to do is to look at the negative space between these two trees. This shape here, this space, to see how far off I am as far as deciding how this tree can be. I might just curve this just a little bit more at the bottom here. Just a touch, just for interest. Just don't want it to be too curvy though. So that'll work nicely. Now, the next tree is just a little bit further back. Okay, it's not exactly on the same length, so it's going to start about here. And what I want is for our third tree to be on this third, if we can manage it. So let's see what we can do here to make the second tree. And don't worry if you don't get it right the first time. I'm going to wiggle this just a little bit more for interest. Okay, so we'll put this one in, and this one's going to be a little narrower than this, but wider than the second tree. So let's just give it a little bit of width here. We've got a big painting, so we can have a little bit of width, more width on that one. And then the third tree is going to angle over and end up crossing this area up here into there. And so by putting the thirds in, we have an idea, whoops, that's not very straight. We have an idea of how we can lay this out. And this one's going to be a little narrower than that one, but not too narrow, because we want them to be a good size. This is what the drawing and painting is all about. And I'm just going to angle that in a little bit so it comes behind that other tree. Angle it down maybe from about there so it comes behind the other tree. And that should work. You get a little straight, a little bit more of a straight feel on that tree at that point. Now don't worry about all of this thick charcoal. It's not. This charcoal just disappears into anything that you're going to put on top of it afterwards. So, and this is the vine charcoal that I'm using here. And that just goes down to the base of that tree. This tree actually comes over this way just a little bit at the base. Let's give it a little bit more movement. And this tree goes that way, and we'll give that just a little more movement. So once we've got our trees in place, that's really the important part. And now we can think about other areas. And so we're looking at the thirds again. And if we look at the thirds, we can see that this area here is about a third if we measure the thirds up. Okay, so we can take this background area and say it goes just about here, but it's not straight. It goes up in some places, it goes down in some places. There's a little light area that goes behind these trees, and then it goes down a little bit more on this side. So it's kind of varied here as to how it looks. It goes up here, there's a little bit more of a darker tone above. We'll put in that darker tone in here, just a bit more. We won't worry too much about the light trees in the background until we get to painting those. Really the big shapes are the important part. A little bit of angle of a shadow down here. So we're looking at the larger shapes as we paint this. The branches we'll add on afterwards, these branches that go out here. That'll be the last thing that we do. So we don't have to worry too much about those. There's a few more shapes here in the foreground that we can add in. There's a lighter shape that kind of comes through here on the ground and goes behind the trees. We can put that in, so we just remember to paint that a bit lighter. Some darker areas down here. Some little interest by diagonal shapes in here too. So I think we're pretty good to go there. This is the larger area here, right, that I see going up there. And this is the top of this lighter area going down here. And so just so that you know where you're looking and you know what you're looking at in your drawing, make sure that you've got those areas in. And any area that's going to be a little darker, you can also just use your charcoal to say that's going to be darker. This is going to be just a little bit darker to start with. And just about the base of this is going to be just a little bit darker to start with. So we're getting a feel for how the tones are going to work on this too. Okay. All of these little trees will go in on the surface once we have the sky in. So we won't paint all of those in and draw all of those in now. It'll be much easier to put the sky in without all of those. And so we can add that detail, all of those other details later. And sometimes at this stage I take a little brush and I just brush off most of that loose charcoal so that it is just a light area behind, especially if I'm going to put the sky in, because the sky is going to be lighter, and then this doesn't interfere and get in the way of any sky areas. Okay, so I'm just going to brush that down just to take away the loose charcoal on the surface. Okay, so we're kind of in the right spot as far as, you know, having our drawing where we want it to be. We've got enough interest in the tree shapes to make them work well, and we can adjust those along the way. So as soon as you've got your drawing finished, we'll move on to the choice of pastels here. Let me take a look and see. What I'm using in general for this class is two different manufacturers, pastel manufacturers. I'm using some Sennelier pastels, these slightly longer ones, and they tend to be a lot brighter. They're very soft in relation to the others. And the other pastels that I'm using are from Unison. And one of the reasons I like Unison is because their colors are fairly muted. But in the next pastel class, I'm going to show you some more different pastels and how you can use those and why it might be better to have a few different ones too. So soft pastels are really nice to work with when you first start. If you have the hard pastels, those are really good for the basic undertones. When I first started painting in pastels, we didn't have much more than that. And so we had to learn how to layer and how to use those on regular paper. But nowadays we are so blessed with all the surfaces that we have, and it makes life so much easier when you're painting in pastel. So we need initially some colors for the sky. Sky areas are not necessarily white, but we will have a little white. So I've got some blue and some light blue and some white for the sky. I'm looking at the photograph and matching the colors approximately to colors that I see in there. When I put this on here, that's pretty close to the color that I'm seeing in the background there. The next lightest colors that we'll need as part of that big sky wash are these yellow greens down here. And so I pulled out a few of those colors, and this is the great advantage of pastel, that you can see your colors in the palette and you can see exactly how your painting is going to look, and if there are colors in your palette that don't work, that don't link together, that feel out of place, you can see that right away. In this case, it's a warm tone painting. They're all analogous colors, pretty much, apart from the blue. Pretty much analogous colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And the blue is just a little contrast there. The blue can be used also in the shadow here, but I have a little gray, that purplish gray, that we can use there too, and that's an option if you want to do that. So those are the colors for the trees. These are the light colors that we'll use in the background, maybe a little bit more yellow, a little bit more of that light green. And then the colors that we use down here are going to be the burnt sienna, sort of gold colors down there, maybe a little bit more of the light green, some darker greens, some brighter greens. So we can see all of those in the mix. So I have all of those dark colors ready to go too. But initially, all we need are the light sky colors to work with, and some of these light yellow greens. Yellow greens particularly here. Okay, so something with yellow in. Now, if you don't have a yellow green, and greens are particularly tricky, and warm greens are tricky to find in pastels. You can find cool greens, the ones with a lot of blue in, but the ones with a yellow in are more difficult. So what you can do is you can use a cooler green like this, and you can overlay a little yellow onto it as you go. If you don't have, so you could use a cooler green, right? Or a cooler green like this perhaps, and then lay a little of the yellow on top as you're working. So if you don't have these colors, we'll just mix those together and make them work. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, I'll just put those to one side for a moment, is to decide how much cloud and how much sky we need in here. This sky does not have to be particularly thick, and we are going to be putting other colors over the top, but not necessarily as much as we see here. So we're going to cover over most of this with sky and most of the center area between the trees, and over here we'll start to put in some of the foliage and just leave a few little sky areas open. Now, one of the things you need to know about that is that when you leave sky areas open like this, little sky holes for the birds to fly through, those are always going to read too light if they're surrounded by dark. So you often need a slightly darker tone of the blue to make those read correctly. Okay, so that's very important to know. Just make sure that you don't end up with those being too bright. And that's a given for anything, any area that is surrounded by dark. The light in that area, because of the dark, will look lighter. Okay, it's an optical illusion. All right, so I'm going to start right away now with the sky color up here. I'm just going to pop it in. I'm going to avoid the tree. But think about the idea that some of the sky is going to be clouds. And I'm going to pop in a little of this. I'm doing it very lightly to start with. Just start to establish this idea of sky. How far down does the sky come? Well, it comes all the way down to about here. So let's just make sure we get that right. And down here it comes down just a little bit more, and down here. And it's behind the back of these guys. So we're kind of in this area as far as the blues go. We don't want to paint sky too much under areas where we're going to put other colours. And so let's use just a little of, this is just the blue-grey that I'm using here now for the white. And it looks pretty white, so you don't always need a white for clouds in the sky. You can get away with something that's just a little bit lighter, a little bit less white, should I say. We'll take a little of that blue up here, just a touch, and we can start to add in some of these lighter colours in this area, the lighter green colours. That one's a little too light right now. This one might be good. Yes, that makes it just a little more green. And the darker colours we'll paint on afterwards. Sometimes in pastel we work like oil, where we paint the darker colours on first, but it doesn't make sense to do that in this particular subject. So we want to make sure we cover the paper, so diagonal strokes are good to use. This way and this way are good to use to cover the paper. Let's get a little bit of that blue going on in there. And we'll bring the blue down into this area here, along with some of the green that we're going to see eventually. It's going to be pretty abstract, this background area, with just a few suggestions of shapes. But let's just get a bit more sky in first. So I'm avoiding the trees, just painting up to the edge of the trees, and you know the colour you're using, so you can come back and reshape the trees and add that in later. I don't want to put too much pastel right about here, because this is where the other trees, the lighter trees, come in. So remember to correct. You're just going to brush out the pastel that you don't need. And if necessary, you're going to lift after you've brushed out as much as you can. And then you'll get back to the surface of the paper. Use your kneaded eraser to lift. Don't go in with a kneaded eraser first, because if you do, you'll just pound that colour into the paper. You always lift first, and then blot, and then you can go back in and lift out. Okay, it's a three-step process. So just be careful about that. And so these trees back here are a little brighter, not quite as bright as that, but just a little brighter. Let's put this colour in. And let's think about shapes now. This has a more interesting vertical shape that comes around the outside of that tree. And you see that tree, those tree areas going up into space, into the sky. And you see a little bit of that coming down here, and a little bit more coming down into this area. And over here, that green gets a touch darker. So let's see if we can find something that's a yellow-green that's just a little bit darker than that. That one's just a bit too, here we go, more like this. There we go. And a little bit of this on top of it will darken it down. So we can darken by using a couple of different colours there. And this comes down with a loose edge, comes all the way down to, yes, about that edge really. We put that in. And now we'll finish off the sky just a little bit more before we start working on any of the other areas. Maybe a few more of the light areas through the sky would be fun to lighten it up a bit. That feeling of nice light back there. So I'm using that light grey, but ultimately we can come in with a white or something just a little bit brighter. Sennelier has a really soft white that's really strong, and I usually save those touches until the last minute. So I'm not going to put in too much of that right now, because it might just be too bright for being in the background. We won't know that until we get all of our colours into the painting. And that's what we have to think about both in watercolour and pastel. See how those colours are working together. If your blue is a little too dark and you'd like to lighten it a bit, I'm not saying this is, but just so that you know, you can add in, it's usually going to be darker at the top of the sky anyway, but you can add in just a little bit of a lighter colour on top and blend very lightly. And blend, if you like, with one of these insulators that you use for pipes. Blends a little better and a little easier on the fingers than your fingers do on the sanded paper. You just have to be careful not to lose your fingerprints on the sanded paper. So a little bit of white in there, a little light tone in there, and so we're going to be pretty loose in the background here to start with. So that's a good start, right? Something really loose like this. Remember, don't start to try and make too much detail until you're ready to understand where the detail is, particularly in a subject like this. And this is a perfect subject for using mixed media for watercolor underneath, because you can establish a lot of this with the watercolor before you put the pastel on. So we'll be doing some of that next time. Okay, just a few more whites in here, just to lighten up that sky a little bit more. And maybe up here, just a little bit more suggestion of clouds, so we get that light feel. If you find that your pastel is skipping over the surface, you just need to lift out a little bit more of the surface, and then you can go back in with your lighter tone. It means that the surface has filled, the texture has filled, and the soft pastels will fill the surface of the paper much more quickly than the other pastels. Now we're going to leave that fairly loosely until we get some of the other colours in. And so now we're going to work on this area down here, this bottom area, where we see some looser colours down here. You can leave a few gaps for the trees if you like, or you can put them on afterwards. It doesn't matter. Either way will be fine. Let's work in the middle tones through this area, and we'll worry about the true darks afterwards. So we won't get too dark just yet until we're sure of where we're going. And one of the places I can see a middle tone, it's probably more like this one, is about here. And I can see this little brighter area. And we can make that a little brighter still by adding a light on top of it later. Okay, so we won't worry too much about making it absolutely perfect right now. And that light kind of comes through on the back side of the tree, on this side. And it's a little yellowish in the center there. So I'm going to put just a little bit of that yellow, and we'll add a bit of yellow to this too, just to start to get the idea of where the light is coming from and going to in this painting. It's a little bit more light in the back there, between the trees. And between those, there's a touch of this warmer tone. And just like any other painting, you're going to be painting light against dark. And so we'll have some of this tone going in here. And overall, this is going to be a little darker, so we can start to add in something just a bit darker as well. And back here, same idea. We're going to be adding in just a little bit of a slightly darker tone in the background there. This will pop the trees forward too, which is useful. Okay, so we're looking big picture here. We're not thinking what's going to happen ultimately. We're not thinking about this little area. We're thinking about the overall feel and what we need in this painting. Just a little bit more light there. A little bit more light on here, so we know where the light's going to be. And this area here is going to be lighter overall. Okay, now there are touches of light in the foreground here and touches of green, so let's get a few of those in. Some really interesting things going on here. If you want to pull your trees down just a little bit more, you can do that. I'm thinking that maybe that might be a good idea, just to pull them down just a touch more. That might work a little nicer, in a nicer way. I think that's going to work better. So down in the foreground we have some darks, we have some dark browns, and just marks right now, just suggestions. We're just beginning to explore. Don't try to finish anything. That tendency to want to finish is really strong, but we need to know where we're going before we start to finish. We need to have an idea of these colours and how they're working together. Now, in here there's a middle tone, and it's fairly bright. Maybe not quite as bright as this, but let's put some of that in. A little bit on this side too. And whether it's as bright or not is up to you, because you're the artist and you can choose how bright or how dull you want to make your colours. A bit more of the light in here in a few places too, so let's put some of that in, just scatter it in. Continue that light down here. And now we'll move into something that's just a little darker, this one, and start to put the idea in. I'm moving upright strokes right now. I know it's a ground area, but everything is growing up, and so I'm using little strokes that go up and down to start that idea of how it feels. Okay, so because I moved the tree down just a little bit, I'm going to move that light area down just a touch too, just a little bit. There we go. And that should work. And that comes into a light green down here. Just a little bit of that feel, a bit more of this feel, and just a touch of light up here. And I will fill in with some middle tones or darks, some more colour, a bit more colour in here. And in the centre here, just a touch more colour. And one of the ways to see this is to squint. Just a slightly darker tone in here, and a slightly darker tone at the base of this little area. And just looking at a few of the little tiny darks that we're going to need eventually. A little bit more dark going down here and down there. And we'll get most of this covered with middle tone now, in various greens, and let's try this one. This one's just a little bright, but we'll come back and adjust that later. Bring that one down just a bit. And I'm going to bring this, since I brought the trees down, I'm just going to bring the top of this down just a little bit more. So a touch more of that yellow in there to bring that down. And that will give us a nice contrast back there too. Okay, so overall, we should have, by this time, our paper covered, relatively covered, by most of the colours that we're thinking about using in those areas. Not necessarily the tones correctly, first of all, but we need to put it all together before we start to work on the rest of the painting. We can't do one little part. If you keep it all loose like this, then at some point you might want to stop before it's finished, and you have the opportunity to do that. If you try to finish it all too soon, one little area, that means you've got to finish everything, and that might not be the way to go on this painting. You might not need to do that. Okay, so once we've got that in, the trees are going to be the last part that we do, and so we don't have to worry about those too much. We need to establish the background first. Okay, now I'm going to be a little bit more precise about some of the shapes that I see up here in the sky. So I'm looking at the photograph and I'm seeing some loose shapes in here. Okay, and they get darker as they go to the top corner in both cases. And I'm not going to include as many as I see on this side. I don't think. We'll leave some of those out. So some of those looser shapes are darker tones of the same sort of color. So that will be that one. And maybe a little bit more varied green. That would be that one. And let's see what else we've got here. Maybe another one of those. Yes, those are very similar, those two greens. Nothing too dark yet, though. Okay, and as we go further into the edge, this is going to be layered. We're going to do a little bit of layering. And we'll come back in with some of these darker tones right on the top. Okay? So look beyond this tree. Look behind this tree to see what you can see. And you're seeing variations of light and dark green. The fact that it's pixelated is actually very nice because we can see it a little bit more clearly. And so I'm going to bring some of those over on the side of the tree, and they go almost over to the next tree. So we'll bring, now I'm thinking in terms of clumps of foliage. So my strokes are going to be in the idea of clumps of foliage, little tiny short strokes overlapping like this. And we'll have some light ones. So we'll need to go just a little bit lighter on that. Let's see if this one will work. Oh, probably the one we started with here. No, let's try that one. Or this one. Yeah, either of those will work. This one's probably better. It's got a bit more yellow in it. So we're going to just make those strokes happen by interspersing them. Now, every so often you're going to put in just a little bit of blue as well, because we have some sky tones in there. Okay, so you're going to mix in those colours, and it's going to be a little bit like a pointillism, where your eye is going to mix all of the colours together initially. Now remember, this is the background. This is an area that right now appears to be very important, but ultimately it will not be important because it's going to be covered by the trees. The trees are going to jump forward as soon as we paint them, and this is going to jump backwards as soon as we paint the trees too. And so we don't have to worry too much about making it too perfect. We just want to get that feeling of foliage. Once we have the feeling of foliage, the branches are going to take care of everything else, and those we'll put on a little bit later. So just some variations of greens, getting just a little bit darker as you go to the top corner there, breaking up those spaces a bit. And the tree itself is in front of these, so don't go too much over the tree on that side. Just a little bit more coming out here. Maybe a touch more of a green feel as it comes into the light. Just a little lighter there. And there's more of a yellow-green feel as we come down here behind the tree at this point. So we can mix those up. So as the light comes through, as we go lower down, the colours can get just a little brighter. Keep still staying the yellows if you can. Yellow, yellow greens, yellow golds, those sort of colours. A little bit of this too. And just before I leave that top corner, I'm going to just add in a darker green here. Just a little bit more of a darker colour, maybe not quite dark enough. There we go. Something just a little bit darker up there. So we've got the feeling of it being layered more. So leave some of the light showing when you add these dark tones up here. And just for suggestion, the dark tones don't have to be that large. Just a little suggestion of those. Now how far down does that come? Oh, it's going to come down to about where I've got it right now, I think approximately. We'll go back in with our strokes here. In the lighter tones and the yellow greens, coming down, the light is more evident, and so we want all of the little areas of foliage to feel lighter. So we'll use less of the darker tones as we come down, just a little bit less. Just a little bit more of the green going up there too. So we're just building up that colour, coming all the way down. I'm looking at this area here where I see the lighter green in the background, so that's mostly what I'm going to use, is that lighter tone. Maybe with a little yellow on the top as well, because it's getting pretty bright down there. As it comes down and catches the light. And don't forget, we have the opportunity to go back in between these and add in some blue. So if you lose all of the blue sky here, you're not lost completely. It's not a problem. So I'm using a yellow, green and yellow to get these lighter tones in here, leaving a little bit of the sky showing and just bringing some of those tones down into this area. As they go towards the edge, just a little bit darker again. Alright, I'm going to stop right about there. So I've established a feel for how that could look. And we've got a little dark area going on back there. Now we're just going to move over to the center. Before we do this area down here, we're going to move across from here to this little area of bright, bright trees back there that are really catching the light. Those are going to have a lot more yellow in them. And they go down to about here. So they're going to have yellow-green, but also some yellow. And they're a large triangle shape. And continue that color down, that light color that I see. Whenever I see something connecting like that, I just bring it down and continue it into that area. Keep a loose bottom on these, loose base on these, go in and out of the areas below. And go just a little bit more. So this continues back here and goes all the way up into the sky in that space. There is a little variation, but not a whole lot as far as lights and darks. A little bit more at the bottom here. So I'll add in just a slightly darker tone back here. Just a little bit more variation at the base. But a lot more yellow and a lot lighter as it goes up into the sky. And here you can take some more sky color if you want to, and you can add in a few more of those little bright clouds to connect with this if you want to make that a little bit lighter, a little bit more interesting. So now we can get into our really pure white sky tone. Change that just a little bit in a few places to break it up. Really only going to see the pure white where the light is stronger, so mostly in the center here. You'll see a little bit more of that pure white in the sky. Okay, everything else is going to be more of a grayed white. Over here particularly, it's going to be a little bit more of a grayed white. And bring in just a touch of that lighter sky color too on this side, so you have a little bit more contrast right on the edge of those dark areas. Okay, now I'm going to go back over the edge of this to make it come in front of those clouds. And we'll just continue it down onto the side a little bit. And it will connect eventually over here with something that's just a little greener. So now we're okay with that part initially. I'm doing vertical strokes for this because of the shape of the subject. Bring in some blue to push it back or to change the shape. That will give you a little bit of green too if you want to. If you decide you don't like that shape, I'm just showing you some options, then you can take it out. Right? Remember, you're not stuck with the pastel, you're not stuck with what you put down. And this is very much like an oil or an acrylic where you can change things. Different from watercolor that we're all used to. Okay, and I'm making this still loose. I'm not doing straight strokes all the way through because it's textured. It has a little texture back there. And then this one goes way up here, up into that area. Have a little bit more of the light green up there too. Vary it just a bit more. And then we're into the sky colour over here. So a bit more of that sky colour coming in. And we'll finish that off just a touch more with some lights and darks up there. And this is the background that we're going to put in some of this foliage up here. Just a little bit of that foliage. Now it needs to be a bit darker than that on this side. So we're going to have to go just a little stronger on this side with that foliage that we're going to link up. Just like watercolor, we paint the foliage first and we worry about the branches connecting it afterwards. So just a bit more colour in here perhaps, a little more green in a few places, just to vary it a bit. So again, changing the colours every inch or two is a really good idea in any type of painting, whether it's watercolour or oil, or doesn't matter. I have just a little bit more of that feeling of, now can you see what happened here when I surrounded that white with this middle tone? See where it jumped out and said, I look lighter than any white that's up here. And that's what I was talking about earlier. So if you have little areas like this of sky that is showing through, you're going to have to tone those down so they're darker than the area around them. Otherwise they're going to jump out too much. So I'll just put a bit of goodie on top of that so that doesn't happen. So it's just an optical illusion. And we'll have to do that probably with the whites up there. Right, so when we've got our background in, we're kind of at the same position. Everything is about the same finish, and we don't want to go too far to detail it yet. And now we're going to work on this area, this lower area here, where we see quite a lot of darks, and we can start to leave some spaces, or you can actually take out some spaces with your brush that will eventually make the trunks. So you can just paint the whole thing in and you can come back and lift out like this to make the trunks afterwards, and that might be the easier way to do it. So there's a couple of big trees back here, or a couple of smaller trees back there, and there's a lot of dark down here, a lot of interest, a lot of dark. Everything's vertical because the trees are going up here, so I'm going to start putting in some vertical darks in a few places. Leave the colours that you've got already, don't cover them completely. And you can see that this is not solid, it's not consistent. There are greens in here, dark greens, maybe not quite that dark, but maybe more like this. There we go. So we have some greens in here, we have some browns in here, we have a wide variety of colours in that area. And that's the joy of pastel, having a wide variety of colours. Okay, and I'm just going to move across to the other side because I'm seeing something similar over here. As I'm looking at this, I'm looking across here and seeing, oh, that looks kind of the same. So let's just do the same on that side. I'll add in just a little bit of dark. Maybe not quite that dark yet. Let's just go slowly towards the darks. And a little bit more through here. Now, what I've got right now is a pretty straight line all the way across here. And that's not as interesting as having something that goes down a little bit into here and becomes a little bit darker. So that changes the feeling of that area. And then as I go across to the other side, it goes down again. So I'll just shoot that down just a little bit and bring that, I'll do that with the green actually, a bit easier. And bring that green across this side and take it up a little bit. So we can come in with that lighter tone up here, just a little bit. So what I'm trying to do is to add interest to this area. We're very good at making straight lines, and nature is very good at not making straight lines. And so we have to follow nature, this one, and make sure that we don't end up with lines that are too straight everywhere. So up here, with a little variation of the darks, going up a little bit into the trees. We see another light tree in there. All of those lights we're going to put on at the end. Don't worry too much about those right now. Let's get a nice established area of colour. Okay, so a little bit more colour in here. And whether you make it the same colour as the subject is, your choice. You don't have to do that necessarily. But we're going close to. And we won't know how dark to make the trees until we've got everything else in either. So it's important that we do that. Just going to add a little more yellow up there as I see it. Okay, so this area here is overall just a little bit lighter. It's got all sorts of different areas of grasses and goodies that we can put on the top afterwards. But we want to establish the overall look. So the way to do that is to squint at this area and see overall how light it is in relation to this. Okay, forget the detail. That surface detail, we put that on right at the end. We don't have to worry about that right now. And I'm just going to lift out a little bit of this pastel over here and add in just a bit more colour in that area. Feels just a bit too flat. Let's add in some lighter colours and then add in some brighter colours. But even go brighter still with that by adding in something really bright at that point. This is a Sennelier pastel. I usually save those for the end because they're really, really soft and they fill up the tooth of the paper very quickly. But you can see that colour in there. You can see that bounce of bright colour. Back here I want to make sure I keep that light that's going through, this light that's going through here. This is my bright little area here that's going to be light and colourful too. It's going to lead your eye up to the tree. This area here can come down just a little bit more. This yellow, bright yellow tone. And it goes to the other side of the tree also. So it goes over here just a bit more. And then in front of that there's a brighter green. A bit of a green that's catching the light. Getting into some of the lighter tones now. In a few places that green is catching the light, and so you can pop those in where you see them. For the rest I'm going to use this green that is fairly bright. And a combination of that one and something just a little bit duller for the greens that you see in here. And intersperse it with some of these red and brown tones. Vertical strokes for things that are growing upright. Okay, we need a little bit more dark on this side, just a touch more of the dark brown on this side. Dark purple would be another choice here if you don't have a dark brown that's really working for you. A bit more green in there. So when we squint, we're seeing that Sennelier colour is really jumping out, so we're going to have to use that in a few more places to make that work, so that it goes through the painting and becomes a colour that goes everywhere and not just in one or two places. Okay, so that's very important to know, that if you add a colour in that is very dominant, you're going to want to put it in many places, not just in one or two. Wow, it's showing up on the screen as being a lot brighter than it actually is. We can calm that down a bit too as we go. So we've got our light pattern going through the trees here, going all the way through, not quite so bright on this side. And we've got a few little lights and darks happening down in these areas too, but not quite as bright. Okay, this is all mostly in shadow. And so there's only just a few touches of light, so you'll just get a few edges of maybe bright light down here, but nothing too bright. And then down here it's going to be mostly middle tones and darker tones. Now we're going to start thinking a little bit more about edges. Okay, now we're going to work on the background and get these areas of birches in, and some of those colours and some of those trees, but we don't have to do all of them. And you can use your brush, if you want to brush out some of these trees to get a shape for them. If you have a brush that's a sideways, a flat brush would work really nicely for that. You can use your flat watercolour brush, but you probably don't want to use it every time you work with pastel, because the pastel paper is very aggressive and will destroy the watercolour brush. Better if you use an oil brush, an old oil brush, or the edge of that would be better. Okay, so I'm pulling out some of those trees so we can just get a suggestion of where they go. And then we can follow those up with some darker tones. Now, one of the ways to do this is to use your charcoal or your charcoal pencil, because those tones are dark. They're not necessarily black, but they are darker. I'm just going to get an extra piece of glassine paper to put over this while we work. I usually have a piece of glassine paper here, so I can just put that over the top of where I've been working, so I don't mess up with my hand all of the things I've been working on. So I'm just going to draw in here with the charcoal pencil. Looks like the shadows on the left-hand side of these trees, so just accent some of these shapes that you pulled out with a little charcoal pencil, or charcoal, vine charcoal will be fine too, especially down at the bottom. And as they go up a little bit, they can get a bit darker. And if we do it with the pencil, then we can follow on with the pastel afterwards. We can establish them in this way. And that works pretty nicely. And we'll take this one up just a little bit further. We'll lose them up in that foliage, so they can be covered with foliage in some places, and one or two of them here on the edge will go up and be right in the front. And so this one can be a right in the front one, and this one maybe over here can be just a little bit closer to us, which means there's not as much foliage over the top of it. But let's make them as varied as possible. And you can have a couple running back here too. It's easier to make them happen with the charcoal pencil. Even though they're white, eventually they won't be. So this one's coming up here just a little bit. I'm not talking about the trees that are on the front here. They're separate, okay? We're talking about anything you see behind these trees. This is behind this area, okay? It's further back. So we're not working on these right now. Don't put these in yet. That's too soon. Okay, just a couple of suggestions of trees way in this background area. And then lighter. And once we've established them, then we can put a little light on them. And for that, you might want to use either a pastel pencil or a harder pastel. Or if you don't have a harder pastel, you're going to use the edge of a pastel, a soft pastel for that. So sometimes I use those harder pastels. Since I don't have them handy today, I'll just use what we've got here. And we're looking at a color that is lighter. And let's see if this is too light. Yes, that's a little too light. See how it's jumping out? So we want something that's a little darker. Let's try the blue for the sky. That's better. That doesn't jump out quite as much. That works pretty well. So we're looking for something this tone. So something in the grey, maybe. That would work pretty nicely. That's just about right. So we're looking for a grey which is close to the tone of the paper. Very close to the tone of the paper. So it's a light middle tone, just a little bit lighter than the paper. I'm going to turn this on its side so I can draw these lines in just a little bit more easily. And I'm keeping it really loose. Okay? And I'm trying to vary them as much as I can. And I'm losing some of that black line as I go. It's so hard not to think about detail when you're doing things like this, but if you can avoid that, it will really help your painting at this stage to not worry too much about detail. So now we have a bunch of trees that look kind of realistic, not wonderfully, but enough. And we have enough detail in those for the moment. Now at the base of the trees, we're going to go back now and tighten them up just a little bit, add in a few more darks, add in some more texture, and most of those darks that I see back there are warm. And so I'm going to use a warm dark brown, just to separate those out just a little bit. Not everywhere, be careful about doing it everywhere. And soften up some of those edges as we go up a little bit with some of these little areas of foliage. So the foliage comes down into this area, so we're going from the top and from the bottom to make these trees work. And we're trying to be a little impressionistic here, a little suggestive of those shapes, and not try to make it too perfect. Bring some of the greens down, bring some of the light yellow greens from the top down now next to those trees. And on the surface you can take up a little green in a few places, maybe up here just a little bit more. A little suggestion of something that's coming on top of those trees, forward towards us. So that would be more of a middle tone and just a little bit of a dark in there. Let's go some dark over the back here, a bit more on this side. So a touch more of that idea of something in the foreground of these trees, something forward, coming forward just a little bit more. And then we can think about the idea of some of these branches going across. And that's really something we'll do more at the end, but we're at the stage now where we could stop and work on that just a bit more. But we're going to finish off the base first. Try not to cover everything you've done already. Let some of the colours show through and overlap colours as much as you can, because that just makes it so much more interesting to look at. Just a little bit of a lighter tone on top there. Don't forget, light on top. And don't forget that all your trees should start in different places here. So they shouldn't all be on the same level. Okay, this one should be lower, this one should be lower, those should be higher. So they're all starting in different spots. Forests are never that precise, they're always very random as far as where the trees go and where they start. Okay, so we've got that feeling of trees coming through there. And later on we can lose some of these little edges too by adding in some foliage on top of them. But right now let's just leave them where they are And let's put a couple more of those trees on this side. And so I'm going to use that middle tone grey again for this tree that I drew in. And a couple more of those that disappear off into these trees. Make them disappear off by adding in some of that area colour over the top of them. Okay? And then just a little bit more variation back here in the greens and the darks on this side too. Touch more of the darker green in here. And at this point you can think about the idea of where you're going to put those extra trees that we'll put in afterwards. We won't worry too much about that right now, but we'll add those in afterwards. So we're looking at this background area and making sure that it has enough interest, enough colour, enough variations of little touches of colour over touches of other colour. Okay. And now we're going to go down into the foreground here just a bit more, just a little bit more dark back here in a few places, just to connect that up and to make sure those birch trees are going to stand out really nicely when we make them. Just a little bit more of that dark, and I'm going to go over that with some green to make that work too. Now you can use your brush to brush away any areas of pastel that have gone over the trees. You want to keep that tree shape. You can open that up a bit more. That's the joy of this particular paper, that you can do that anytime you like. Okay, so we're in good shape as far as the background goes. Let's go just a little bit further. Just a few more darks in here as that gets to the base. And more of those lighter tones back here. Something more like that in the background. And some of these will calm down with softer edges when we finish, but right now we want to keep it like this. Now let's see if we can finish off a little bit more of the foreground, and then we'll start working on the birch trees, okay? So down in the foreground here we have some darks coming in and out of these little areas of light. Let's put some of those in. And some of those are dark greens and some are dark browns. So I'm just putting a few more of those shapes in there so we get a feel for how that's working. This little area here is darker underneath the light top. So we'll make that darker. Let it come over here and join with this dark a little bit. Joining the darks is a good thing to do as much as you can. And in this area here we need a little bit more colour. So I'll add just a bit of that warmer tone in there too. Touch of that in here and over here and in the background. Now we'll let some of that brown go back up into that foliage. and a little bit of the foreground colour go back up into that foliage. We'll keep that light down here. Now you can bring in your darker greens down the bottom here too if you want to, something really strongly dark. Just to tone that area down. So right now we've got a lot of little lights going on that might be just too big, and later on we can calm those down a bit too. So here, this little area here might be just a little too bright, too large for being such a bright area. It needs just to be small like that. This one's okay, but it could use just a little breaking up. And so we can break that up just a wee bit. We can also change it from the other side and negatively paint it down from the back to vary it just a bit more. Add in a few more warms, and maybe vary it as it comes across here. Make it just a little bit darker as it comes between the trees here. So we're losing just a bit of that feeling of light. We don't want too much poppy light. We want light that reads as sunlight coming through the trees. So sometimes that sunlight has just a little bit less brightness down at the bottom here. So you need to be careful to capture that. That's my pastel here. Okay. So a little bit more green here will take care of calming that down a bit in this area. So we have some nice little bright tops, and this area here between the trees can be brighter. This little space here, just in there. And then calm that down, change the shape of it just a bit with some slightly darker tones. And everything else now in the foreground is going to have a bit more of a dark feel. Green darks, brown darks. Break up that middle tone with just a few darks that run through it. Okay, I'm going to stop there with that foreground for the moment, and we can calm that down and we can change the shapes a little bit more as we go. Let's stop right there for a minute. Just add a little bit more light on this one, and then I'm going to stop. So we've kind of got light coming through all the way. Maybe just a touch more on this area here, going through in there. But everything else is darker. Okay, now we're ready to work on the trees. So the big trees first, and then any trees that we want to put in on the side we can work on now. And add just a touch more of that yellow green back here. It's just a little bit thin. So before we start on the trees. Now the trees are going to have a shadow on one side, and they're going to have, and I'm using a sort of lilac tone for that, and they're going to have a light on the other side. So I'm going to check the shadow colour. And the shadow colour should be, let's just check the light against the shadow colour. Light can be pure white, and so we need the shadow colour to be 2 or 3 tones darker than that. So I think maybe I need just a little bit more of a darker tone to make this happen. So this one's just a bit darker, or this one is just a little darker still. This one feels like it's going to be close. I think I'll use a combination of those two, this one and this one, to make that shadow colour. So now I'm going to be a bit more careful about the outside edge of the tree, and I'm going to come back in with the background colours and tighten it up even more when we've finished. So this is my shadow going all the way up. And that shadow colour covers all of this side of the tree, and just the little left-hand side of the edge of this tree is white. Pretty much everything else is in shadow. Now generally when you see a shadow like that and you see light, you're going to see a little warm tone in the centre. And so I'm going to put in just a little bit of a warm, something more along the lines of this brownish tone here. Just a touch in there to make the tree a little bit more dimensional. Now I'm going to come in with this light, and this isn't a pure white, this one's just a little bit less than pure white. Let's put that in on the side of the tree. That goes down to about here, it comes across just a little bit in a few places. It's a little bit wider up here. So all the way along the tree it varies. You can see it varying all the way through. Gets a little lighter in some places, gets a little darker in other places, thinner. Up here it stops just a bit, and then it picks up again up here, where you see the edge happening. And the rest of the tree then is going to be shadowed. So we can run that shadow next to this in some places where it's cut back just a little bit more. You can use your sky color to tighten that up on the edge, on the outside edge, on both sides. You can use the background colors to tighten it up down here, background yellows and greens, to negatively paint back there and tighten that edge up a bit. Sometimes it's easier to do it this way around. Make sure you've got that tree big enough. It feels to me like I could extend it out a bit more. So I'm going to come here with my slightly darker tone on the outside and just pull it out just a little bit more. And the lighter tone I'll bring back over just a bit more. And if you're using the white tone, that's the warm tone that goes next to the light. Yes, I'm just extending this shadow out a bit. I'll give it just a little bit more of a light tone here. And on this edge, tighten that up just a bit more. And down here. This is brighter than the colour behind, so on the back side here I'm just going to make the colour behind just a little bit less bright to make that work. So the tree is the one that stands out here. A little darker tone in there too will help that. Extend that up, bring it down just a bit. Vary it, is what I'm saying. Okay, and we've got just a tiny bit of light in here. Do we have a little tiny edge on that? And just a little tiny edge on that too. Now some of that light comes across the tree, just a little bit more, especially down here. Just a touch more into the tree. And the rest of it not so much. Okay, we're going to do that on all three trees before we start to put the markings on them. So let's get the next tree in, where you see the light and shadow. And you might need to come back with your sky colour and just tighten up that tree first so you know where you're going. A little bit of that in there in a few places. Oh, maybe the white colour. Just so we know what we're drawing there, painting there. So for this one I'm going to use the same tone. This is in front of that background foliage, so just a little touch of that darker tone in the back here. This could be a grey or it could be a purple grey. It could be any of those colours. And make it just a little darker right at the top, but not as much as you see on both of them, not as much as you see in the picture. But the reality is it does get darker as it goes up into the sky. And then it will look lighter against a dark background. So let's pull that down. And now we can start adding in some of that white tone on the edge. You see how these trees are popping forward? It's really important that you can see that. A little bit of a light up there. Touch maybe here where it's catching the light. A little bit more as it bends out here just a bit. Then it seems to be in shadow for a lot of the area, and then it catches the light again down here. And that's a nice dramatic light pattern on that particular tree. Now I'm going to tighten it up with the darker tone. Oops, this one. Tighten up the edges so they're a little bit sharper. Tighten up the edges with the background too. Bring the background in to make it sharper. The background's different all the way around, so it could be sky or it could be foliage or it could be whatever you want it to be. Okay? Just a little bit light around here, but not white. So you can suggest with a sky colour something that's just a little lighter, or with one of the lighter purple tones if you have one of those. There's something here that's not quite white. It might be nice to put a little edge there that's not too bright. Now we need a contrast, so if we have a dark area of the tree, we're going to have a lighter area in the sky to make that work. So I'll have this little lighter blue in the sky here against the darker part of the tree. Make that stand out a little bit more. Tighten up those edges a bit. You can add just a little bit more blue in there in a few places. Now we'll bring this light across here from the other side, this shadow. Okay, so we're good to go on that. We can soften that down just a little bit. Darken the top just a wee bit. and the branches will take care of the rest of it. So we've got our light coming down the bottom here, which is what we wanted, coming all the way down to the ground actually on this one. And just a little bit of a light angle on that. A bit more light on this one. Contrast. And now the last one, same idea, exactly the same idea. This is going to be that lighter tone all the way through, just a little bit narrower. So I'm going to start by cutting it back with some of the colours that I see in the background to start with. Make it just a little tighter. And then we're almost on our way with this one. Just a little bit of sky colour in here. A bit of the lighter sky colour in a few places. And just some of those greens that we've been using up in the foliage. And you have to vary them, you have to go back and use all of the colours that you've used in the first place to make that work. Now this tree is in front of all that background foliage, except, well, it is, I think, even right at the top there. So I'm going to make it darker up here to start with. Just a little bit darker. And then I'm going to run that lighter tone, shadow tone down. And now we'll add the light on the edge. The light on the edge is here. This is the drama in this painting. This is what makes it really interesting to look at. A little bit of extra light in here. Shape the tree just a little bit more with that. And a little bit more up here in the little highlight that picks up right about there. And now I'm just going to darken the back side, just a little touch. And that warm tone, you're going to use that warm tone that goes in between the light and the shadow on both of these. Just a touch gives interest. Now we're ready to put on some of the pattern that we see on the trees. And that pattern is dark, basically. And so it starts off as a dark tone down here and goes across the base of the tree. Comes around here like this. A little bit more going over there. Touch going around here. Touch coming on this side. So we can start to pattern the trees. Remember that there is perspective involved in that pattern. And that as you go further up, those marks tend to be more convex. Okay? At your eye level, they'll be straight. Below your eye level, they'll be more concave, like they are here. So the eye level in here is about this area, just about there. So then it starts to change direction. So everything you see up here will be more of this shape. And this also helps the tree to be more dimensional when you do this. Very important to know that. So a few more marks down here, and then we'll start to add on some of those branches. A little bit more, starts to get a bit straighter here. Just starts a little bit to curl on this point, Starts to come down just a little bit more there. As soon as you start adding these marks in, they become birch trees just like that. I'm going to make this just a touch lighter in this area. This tree just a little bit lighter there. Not white, but just a touch lighter. Part of the issue here is the tree is against an area that's not too dark. So we need to have some of it lighter and some of it just a little darker to make that work. Okay, a few more marks on here. Going in this direction, there's usually a mark down here. The dark area of the tree usually splays out just a little bit. The same thing happens on this one. You get a little dark on the back side and it splays out into that area. Now we can put a few smaller marks in a few places to make it look a little bit more worn. Maybe something not quite so dark would be good for that. There we go. Just a little suggestion of wear or marks on the trunk. I'll make that look a bit better. Same on this one. Okay, and the little tiny one seems to be dark on the right-hand side. It seems to have a lot of dark in there, but I'm not going to do a line all the way down because that's too much. Put in the markings on both sides. Make it a little bit darker there. A little darker up here. And let's just really push that light on the tree on these now. I'm going in with a brighter white on the side of the tree, a pure white, to really bounce that white. Okay, and the last thing we need to do on this painting is to just think about the branches and the trunks that we're going to put in on the right hand side. And attaching these trees to any areas. The foliage can go up and over this dark area at the bottom of the tree too. So instead of having a straight line down here, you can have some of those green grasses just going up and over and breaking that up just a little bit. So it feels more connected. So overall, this is a relatively abstract interpretation of this subject. It's realistic in some places, but not everywhere. It has the feel of birch trees right now, without having too much of the detail, which is what I'm aiming for here. Just a little bit more light up there on that tree. And now you can use your pencil to draw in some of these branches. This is a good place to put a branch right now, and oftentimes they're dark and they connect into the tree, and they're going to go over the top here. We should put a few in the background here before we decide to put the large ones on, just so we know where we're going. And I'm just going to put a few back here, not as many as I see in the painting. I'm just drawing in a few of these. So we get those in first, and then we can add in the other areas on the big trees afterwards. Now, drawing those in with charcoal is great, but you've got to add a little colour to them. So something dark brown, but maybe not quite as dark as the area on the other tree. And we'll just make those just a little bit less strong. Okay. Just a little suggestion of tree trunks here. Let those go up and into the area that you've got up there, and you can add just a few more darker tones in this area now before we move on to the other tree. Just a few little suggestions of darker greens up here, now that you've got those branches in. And maybe something a little bit lighter in a few places. Just a little variation of those colours, connecting to the other side, but not as wide, not as big. And you can use that brown to extend out a few more branches, but probably not too many right about here. Probably that's enough. Just have a couple of trees going in there on that side. Now we can do the big branches that go over the top. Or if you want to, you can do a few of these little branches over here on the other side first before we add in the big branches. So we'll just make this tree come forward a bit. This one and this one, just to come forward a little bit more. And we'll pop in a few branches at the top here for these. Before we add in the smaller ones. And that's probably enough. Okay, and now we'll add in the ones for the big tree, and I'm going to put this in black to start with, and they're actually a dark brown. So if you have a dark brown pencil, you could do it that way. But this branch is going to be a little heavier, a little stronger. It's going to go across here, and it's going to be thicker than that. So once I got it in, I can take my dark brown and extend it out just a little bit, so it becomes a little thicker. And reads a little bit better. And take a couple of branches off that. And that will be good. Let's put another one in down here. Now this one's going to go over this because these are behind this tree. So this branch will go over the top, like that. And now we can add the dark in. And connect it to the tree. Always connected, quite often inside the tree, not right at the edge. And then just a few little suggestions of smaller branches that are going off that. One here maybe, another one there. Those can just be done with a pencil, and you don't have to have the brown in there, but if they're just a little thicker, you can add a little brown into that. Thicken that up a bit. And maybe we'll thicken it up as it comes down into the tree here, just a bit more too. Okay, so just a couple more on the little tree here. Maybe one coming out this way, they often come in that direction. And maybe one coming out here that goes in front of that back tree. And then I think we're just about done with this little guy. Now usually at the top of the tree there'll be a few more branches going off, so if you want to just fill that area up a little bit more, you can have just a couple more of these branches heading out. Just with the charcoal pencil if you like, or if you want to just go over it with the brown. I'm going to use the slightly lighter brown up here. And then as far as the foreground is concerned, we're pretty much done with that, but you can, if you want to, make it a bit more detailed, you can do that. Just going to push this edge of this tree back just a little bit with the sky colour. So to make it detailed, you're going to put some linear work down there. So you can use your charcoal pencil for suggestions of darker foliage. You can use some of the lighter pastels for just some suggestions of the tops of areas of light foliage, the tops of areas of dark foliage, and just a small amount of detail will be enough down there. You don't need a whole lot. If you're really dark, you can have that. If you want to be green, you can have that. Take the colours that you've used already and just extend them out into little areas of suggestions of, and again, it doesn't have to be too much. In fact, less is more in these little goodies. Far more. You just have a few suggestions of some light areas. Few suggestions down here, something not quite so light. Bring in the dark here and just give that a little bushy edge too. And bring this one down here just a little bit more. Introduce just a small amount of light in that foreground, middle tone in that foreground. Just connect up some of these darks. Here might be a good idea, especially at the edges. And this is a little stripy on this side, so I'm going to change that a bit. And you might want to do that too. So you can just adjust that down just a wee bit and bring back some of that green in a few other places. So just a few little touches is all you need in this area now. And remember that you can paint negatively, so you can come back with your background colour and paint down and make shapes in the foreground as well. So that same thing could happen here. And maybe just a little bit darker there. There we go, that one is what we need there. And you can bring those shapes down and break up that foreground area just a wee bit. Okay, I think we're going to say that's pretty close to being finished today. And I'm going to just come back and check in with you. and make sure you're doing okay with that. So we've established the light on the trees, which was the whole point of this painting, and we established a background that supports that light of the trees. And the difficult part is doing all of these little suggestions of goodies down in the foreground. More difficult than a lot of other parts of the painting. So that's something you can practice maybe on a spare piece of paper to see how you could make that work. And here I'm going to put in just a little bit more of that light feel along the edge. Take those up just a little bit more. And I think we're just about good to go there. So just look and see if anything's jumping out and saying, is it working? Is it not working? Does it need some help? Is it too straight? Can I change angles? Can I change interest? Can I vary it just a little bit more? It's really what it's all about. So I hope you've enjoyed this class this afternoon, and we're going to go on to a few more things with pastel in the next session of classes. So a little bit more mixed media coming along, and so I hope you'll enjoy that too. So I'm going to stop there before I change it too much and say I think we've got everything we need in this particular painting.